You have been in labor for 2 days. The candles are low. The midwife hasn't slept. There are women in the room who have stopped making eye contact with you. And you notice. You notice because when women stop making eye contact with you during labor, it means they have already started grieving. The baby is not coming. And then the door opens, and a man walks in carrying something wrapped in cloth. And the midwife steps aside. And you understand, without anyone saying a single word, that whatever is about to happen next was not planned for you to survive. This is not a horror story. This is Tuesday. For most of human history, this was just Tuesday. And here is something that tends to stop people cold. The procedure we now treat as routine only became reliably survivable for the mother approximately 140 years ago. 140. For everything before that, across thousands of years of human birth, surviving it was the exception, not the rule. That man with the wrapped cloth, he was not a doctor. He was not there to save the woman on the table. He was there because a decision had already been made, a decision that had been made the same way, in the same kind of room, across thousands of years of human history. And the decision was this: the baby comes first. The mother is the cost. 1 in 5 babies born on Earth today arrives via C-section. Your mother might have had one. You might have been born that way. It is so routine that people schedule it like a dentist appointment. Pick a date, show up, go home, complain about the recovery. What nobody tells you is how recently that became true, or what it looked like before it was. We are going back to ancient India, to Rome, to medieval Europe, and to the brutal turning point in the 1800s where everything finally changed. We are going to find out what they actually did, what they actually used, and what certain philosophers, surgeons, and church officials said about a mother's life that is going to make you genuinely angry. There is a myth about Julius Caesar that almost everyone believes that is completely wrong. There is a medieval church debate that is so cold it will stop you cold. And there is one woman, one specific recorded moment, that changed everything. Let's go. Before Rome existed as a republic, before the Greeks had written down most of their philosophy, before any of the civilizations we think of as ancient were doing anything particularly sophisticated, a physician in India was performing surgery, not folk medicine, not ritual, surgery, with instruments, with documented technique, with a text that classified procedures the way a modern medical school classifies them today. His name was Sushruta, and he is the reason this story does not start where you think it starts. The Sushruta Samhita, his collected medical writings, dating to around 600 BCE, is one of the most disorienting documents in the history of medicine. Disorienting because of how modern it reads. The man was reconstructing noses in 600 BCE using skin grafts, which alone should make your brain short-circuit. But what gets almost no attention, even among people who know Sushruta's name, is what he wrote about complicated childbirth. The text describes, in clinical detail, procedures for when a baby could not be delivered naturally. It categorizes the positions a baby might be stuck in. It describes instruments, actual metal surgical instruments, designed specifically for extracting a fetus. It talks about what a trained practitioner should do, step by step, when a birth has gone wrong. This is not folk medicine. This is not a prayer and a hope. This is documented surgical knowledge, organized and transmitted through a formal medical tradition, in a civilization that understood, really understood, that the human body could be intervened upon. And here is the thing that complicates the picture immediately. Sushruta also wrote about something called the Shalyagrahanam, the removal of a dead fetus to save the mother's life, which means that even in 600 BCE, even with this level of sophistication, the conversation already contained that specific horror. The baby is gone. Can we save the mother? Is it even worth trying? The answer, in Sushruta's tradition, was yes. The mother's life mattered. The text is clear on this. Instruments existed for this purpose. Practitioners were trained for this purpose. Now here is the class divide that was already baked in from the very beginning. Sushruta's knowledge existed inside a formal medical tradition. It was transmitted through apprenticeship. It required a trained practitioner who had studied under another trained practitioner. If you were wealthy, connected, living in or near a center of learning, you might have access to this. If you were a farmer's wife in a village 3 days' walk from anywhere, you had a midwife, whatever herbs were available, and whatever strength you had left. The gap between those two realities was, in many cases, the gap between living and dying, but the knowledge existed, which means nobody in history gets to claim this was unthinkable before the modern era. It was thought about. It was documented. The question was always whether you had access to the people who had read the document. Here is a piece of trivia almost everyone on Earth knows, and almost everyone on Earth has completely wrong. Julius Caesar, the Roman general, the dictator, the man who got stabbed 23 times in the Senate, was supposedly born by cesarean section. It's right there in the name. Caesar, cesarean. Seems obvious, seems settled. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, would like a word. Here is the problem with the Caesar birth story. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was alive. Not just alive at the moment of his birth, alive for decades afterward. She was, by multiple historical accounts, an educated, formidable woman who was deeply involved in her son's upbringing and political education. She outlived his early career. She was present in his adult life. In ancient Rome, a cesarean section on a living woman was not survivable. This was not a matter of debate. The procedure as it existed, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no understanding of infection, killed the mother, every time, without exception. If Aurelia Cotta had undergone a cesarean, she would have died shortly after Julius Caesar was born. She did not die shortly after Julius Caesar was born. Therefore, Julius Caesar was not born by cesarean. So where does the name come from? Nobody completely agrees. One theory is that the word caesarean derives from the Latin caedere, to cut, and has nothing to do with Caesar at all. Another is that an ancestor, somewhere in the Caesar family line, was born this way, from a mother who did not survive, and the name carried forward as a kind of grim family marker. Either way, Julius Caesar himself was almost certainly born the conventional way. But here is what Rome actually did have: a law. The Lex Caesarea, and yes, there's that word again, was a Roman legal statute that mandated one specific thing. If a pregnant woman died, or was dying, before delivery, the baby had to be cut from her body. Not to save the mother was already gone, or going. The law existed entirely to give the baby a chance. Let that structure sink in for a second. The procedure was legally codified, not as a medical intervention to help a woman in distress, but as a protocol to be followed after or during her death. The mother is not the patient. The mother is the container. And once the container is no longer viable, the law says you open it. This is the framework that Rome handed to the next 1,000 years of Western history. Not Sushruta's framework, where both lives mattered and instruments existed to serve both outcomes. Rome's framework, where the calculus was already settled before anyone picked up a blade. The class divide in Rome had a specific flavor. Wealthy families had physicians, trained Greek physicians often, who had studied in Alexandria or Athens and brought real medical knowledge into Roman households. If something went wrong in a wealthy home, there was someone present who had at minimum read about what to do. Poor women labored with midwives, experienced, often skilled, but working entirely without surgical capability. If the baby would not come, the midwife's options ran out fast. What happened after that depended entirely on who else was in the room and what they were willing to do. Now, medieval Europe. This is where the story stops being uncomfortable and starts being something else entirely. This is the chapter that the hook was built on. Because medieval Europe took Rome's legal framework, the mother as container, the baby as the priority, and added something to it that made the whole thing colder. It added theology. By the medieval period, the Catholic Church had become the dominant institutional force in European life, and the Church had a position on what happened when a birth went wrong. It was not a soft position. It was not a nuanced position. It was a position that had been debated, formalized, and handed down through centuries of canon law. The soul of an unbaptized infant was in danger. That was the premise. An infant who died before baptism could not enter heaven. The stakes, in the Church's framework, were not just physical, they were eternal. A mother's death was a tragedy. A soul lost to limbo was a cosmic catastrophe. And when those two outcomes were placed on a scale, the church's answer was consistent: cut the baby out. There is a specific figure here who deserves his moment: François Rousset, a French physician, who in 1581 published a text advocating cesarean section on living women, not dead women, living women. His argument was that the procedure could save both mother and child. He reported cases he claimed to have evidence of. He was almost entirely ignored, and when he wasn't ignored, he was attacked. Because the medical and theological consensus of the era was not interested in whether the procedure could save the mother. The procedure existed for one purpose, and the mother's survival was not that purpose. Now let's talk about who was actually performing these procedures, because this is where it gets viscerally real: barber surgeons. In medieval Europe, the division between physicians and surgeons was absolute and deliberate. Physicians were educated men, university-trained, literate in Latin, theoretically sophisticated. They diagnosed, they prescribed. They did not, as a professional matter, touch the body with instruments. That was considered beneath them. Manual work, craft work. Surgery was done by barber surgeons, men who cut hair and shaved faces and, when called upon, also cut into human bodies. Their training was apprenticeship. Their tools were shared between barbering and surgery. Their understanding of infection was non-existent, because the germ theory of disease would not arrive for another several centuries. If you were a woman in medieval Europe and your labor went catastrophically wrong, and someone decided that the baby needed to come out surgically, the person coming through the door was not a physician. It was a barber surgeon, with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no understanding of why wounds became infected, just a blade and whatever they had learned by watching someone else. The survival rate for mothers who underwent cesarean section in medieval Europe was, in practical terms, 0. Not nearly 0. Not very low. 0. There are vanishingly few recorded cases of a mother surviving the procedure before the late 19th century in the Western medical record. What the procedure meant, in practice, was that the decision had already been made. The mother was not going to survive this birth. The question was only whether the baby would. And here is the class divide at its most brutal. Wealthy women, noble women, merchant wives, women with access to the best available care, had slightly better odds in the sense that they had more people in the room and more resources available. But slightly better odds than 0 is still approximately 0. What wealth actually bought you in this era was more sophisticated management of a normal birth, better nutrition during pregnancy, a more experienced midwife. If the birth went catastrophically wrong, wealth could not save you. The procedure was the procedure. The outcome was the outcome. Poor women had none of those advantages going in. A peasant woman laboring in a village had a midwife, neighbors, and whatever herbal knowledge existed locally. If the baby would not come, what happened next depended entirely on the specific people in that specific room on that specific night. Some of those women survived through sheer endurance. The baby eventually came, somehow, at tremendous physical cost. Many did not. There is no clean data on how many women died in childbirth in medieval Europe. Record-keeping of that kind did not exist for ordinary people. But historians who have studied what records do exist, burial records, church records, the occasional chronicle, consistently find that dying in childbirth was not a rare event. It was a common one, common enough to be expected, common enough to be prayed against. The mothers who did not make it did not get monuments. They did not get chapters in history books. They got at most a line in a parish record, and then they were absorbed into the enormous silence that surrounds the female experience of this entire era. Something started to crack in the 1800s. Not all at once, not cleanly, but the pieces arrived in a sequence that, looking back, feels almost unbearably slow given what was at stake. The first piece was anesthesia. 1846. Ether. The discovery that you could render a person unconscious and perform surgery without them experiencing every moment of it in full. This alone was transformative across all of medicine. But for cesarean section specifically, it meant that the procedure was no longer being performed on a fully conscious woman who could feel everything happening to her body. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental change in what the procedure was. The second piece was antisepsis. 1867. Joseph Lister. The understanding Genuinely revolutionary for its time, that infection was not random, not the result of bad air or divine displeasure, but the result of microorganisms that could be killed with the right compounds. Surgical instruments could be cleaned, hands could be cleaned, wounds could be managed in ways that dramatically reduced the chance of the infection that had been killing surgical patients, including cesarean mothers, for all of recorded history. These two things together did not immediately transform outcomes. Medicine moves slowly. Knowledge spreads unevenly. A discovery in an Edinburgh lecture hall takes decades to become standard practice in a rural hospital. But the trajectory had changed. For the first time, it was at least theoretically possible to imagine a cesarean section that the mother survived. And then there is this moment, 1879, the rural highlands of what is now Uganda. A Scottish medical student named R.W. Felkin, traveling with a missionary expedition, witnessed a cesarean section performed by a local healer, not a Western physician, not a hospital, on a young woman of about 20. Her first pregnancy. The healer used banana wine to sedate her and to clean the wound. He used a cauterizing iron. He massaged the uterus in a specific way that Felkin documented carefully. When Felkin returned 11 days later, her wound was healing. She was alive. Felkin published this. The Western medical establishment received it with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, because what it implied was that in some parts of the world, people had figured out pieces of this problem that European medicine had not. The knowledge was not where the Europeans had assumed it was. In the Western record, the first reliably documented cesarean section where the mother survived in the modern surgical era is typically dated to around 1882. German physicians Max Sanger and Ferdinand Adolf Kehrer, who developed a technique for suturing the uterus after the procedure rather than leaving it open. That suture technique was the thing that made survival possible at scale. The mother could bleed to death from an unsutured uterus. Close it properly, and the odds changed. And here is where the class divide takes one final infuriating turn. Because the women who benefited first from these advances, anesthesia, antiseptics, the suture technique, were wealthy women. Women in cities, women with access to hospitals and trained surgeons who had read the latest European medical journals. The knowledge existed, but access to it was not evenly distributed. A poor woman in a rural village in 1885 was not living in the same medical era as a wealthy woman in a Berlin hospital in 1885. They might as well have been centuries apart. The gap closed eventually, but it closed slowly, and in the meantime, the same pattern that had defined this entire history repeated itself one more time. The women with resources got the benefit of every advancement first. Everyone else waited. The shift in the conversation that happened over the second half of the 1800s is still worth sitting with. Because for the first time, after thousands of years, the medical debate was no longer, do we perform this procedure to save the baby while accepting the mother's death? The debate became, can we perform this procedure and save both? The mother entered the equation as a patient, as a life to be preserved, as someone whose outcome mattered in its own right. That shift sounds obvious. It sounds like it should have happened much earlier. And it should have. The fact that it took until the late 19th century is not a medical failure. It is a cultural one. And the fact that it took even longer to reach the women who needed it most is something else entirely. Here is a number that tends to genuinely land when people hear it. The procedure we now treat as routine only became reliably survivable for the mother approximately 140 years ago. That's it. 140 years since survival stopped being the exception, in a species that has been giving birth for hundreds of thousands of years. For everything before that, every civilization we covered today, every era, every century, the working assumption was that if the situation reached the point of surgical intervention, the mother was not coming home. She might be dying already. She might already be gone. Either way, the procedure was not for her. And yet births kept happening. Humanity kept continuing. Women kept walking into that room knowing, on some level, what the stakes were. Knowing that their bodies were the threshold through which the next generation had to pass, and that the threshold itself could kill them. They knew this. Women in ancient India knew this. Women in Rome knew this. Women in medieval villages across Europe knew this. They knew it And they did it anyway, because there was no other way for the species to persist. The C-section you schedule on a Tuesday afternoon, the one that takes 45 minutes, the one where the anesthesiologist asks if you want music, the one where you're home in 3 days and annoyed about the recovery time. That procedure is the end of a very long road. And most of the people who walked that road before us didn't make it to the end. The women who didn't, they don't have chapters, they don't have monuments. They have, at most, a name in a ledger, if anyone thought to write it down. But they are the reason you are here. Every single one of us is descended from a birth that had to succeed. And for a very long time, success was never guaranteed.